listening to these 5 panelists, I'd like to get some Lemon-san's opinion first. Do you have any comment on these 5 panelists' comment?
Yes, I feel like there so many really interesting comments have been raised and questions have been raised. And maybe we can just address a few of them right now and let more evolve in the discussion. One of them, maybe the most important place to start, is in the differences and similarities, let's say, between Benjamin Toft's research and our own project. And what I found so interesting, because at first I thought, well, there does seem to be a really different response that they got in their research versus us, because we also do very similar research. In fact, Ben and I spoke when they first started their research about their methods and about some of the questions that they might ask. And so we go and talk to people and ask them, what do they value and trust? We talk with them and observe them and think about, observe how they make their evaluations of trustworthy news. What I think there's some actually very interesting similarities. So when Ben says that journalists have different ways of describing trustworthiness, and they talk about transparency, for instance, and I think that's the biggest one. When we talk about transparency, mostly we're talking to journalists. And when we talk to the public, that breaks down into these various areas. So people talk about agenda. We heard that in Professor Toft's research. They wonder if there's some sort of motive or agenda behind the news that they're not privy to. We heard the very same thing. And so that's why we ask for transparency about agenda, and we ask for disclosures around things like funding, things about like practices, corrections. And so some of the very things that if we go deeper into the research that Professor Toft did, those are the things that people mentioned. And so in the end, I wasn't that surprised, because I found that there are, in fact, a lot of similarities, which is great. I found it quite interesting too, that they found this group about the untrusting, called the untrusting, and I felt that's something that many of you have brought up. We look at what the folks, I guess, the component of that untrusting audience that might be willing and interested to think about how do they trust and how can they trust. So one of the things that we discovered in our research very strongly was that people did talk a great deal about wanting to be informed. They wanted to look for trustworthy news. So 82% in a study with Ipsos around the world said that they seek out trustworthy news. So there's this group of uncaring and there's a group of seeking out. So and one of you brought up, well, where should we focus our attention? And I would say the Trust Project is focusing its attention on the middle. We call it the anxious middle. It's the group of people who do want to be informed, but they're anxious about how do they make decisions about being informed. So how do they decide? They're less confident in their ability to make decisions about what to trust. So the trust indicators they do not say trust this or don't trust that, and that's very important. Instead, because we're not asking people to trust the Trust Project or trust me, we're trying to help them trust themselves and build a better lexicon, a better awareness of how to make those evaluations on their own and build confidence. I'm trying to think. The one other big area, should I continue or do you want me to stop for the time being? I guess I'll continue.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you later. Thank you.
Okay,
Kaya-san.
yes.
Tov-san, Dr. Tov, please.
Hello. Thank you for all the really interesting insights provided by the panel, and thank you for inviting me to discuss our research with you. I think there's I agree with what Sally Lerman was just saying, but there are a lot of similarities, even though I think a lot of our focus has been on some of the segments of the public for whom who tend to be somewhat less engaged, less interested in paying as close attention to some of the details about journalistic practices. I will also say many will express kind of strong desire, even among that group, a desire for having tools available to better understand differences between sources of information that they're encountering online. This, population of people for whom they are digital natives and are sort of accustomed primarily to getting information on digital platforms, that many are very frustrated by the experience, even if they're not particularly trusting of news. They do kind of struggle to make sense of so often their sense of conflicting information, their perceptions of just sort of not knowing how to differentiate between the sources they're encountering. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, for news organizations is that for this sort of population of people who are relatively indifferent towards news, they have a very different relationship with any individual news organization, if any at all. They tend not to have grown up with a very strong sense of familiarity or connection to those brands, and so their experience is largely mediated by their use of these platforms, and their knowledge about what goes into one news organization's practices versus another is pretty limited, and so they're somewhat more dependent on the as the point was made in one of by one of the panelists, they're sort of more and more dependent on the platforms themselves for the form in which the information appears that they're actually engaging with. I do think that ultimately what's needed, I don't think, it's not necessarily realistic to say you can sort of ignore the platforms, particularly if you are aiming to reach those audiences, younger audiences who are more and more dependent on them. But, ultimately, when you look at sort of trust in the platforms themselves versus trust in news organizations that distribute their content on platforms, often trust, not consistently, depends on the platform, depends on the country, but often you have very high rates of trust in some of those platform organizations. And I think it comes down to, this is based on our conversations with individuals, but we're doing another round of survey data this summer where we hope to get a little bit more depth on this. But our sense is that a lot of it comes down to people find the platforms useful and relevant in their daily life in a way that too often they don't find news to be. And if anything, they find news to be a kind of negative experience, and something that they don't really enjoy. And I think that's ultimately the one of the biggest challenges for building trust, even though it's not directly related to trust. If the product you're selling or trying to sort of engage with the public on is not something that they're that interested in, except for the segments of public who are hyper engaged in politics and see that as the reason why what you're publishing really matters, that's a big challenge. And as long as people are, view the information itself through that lens, it's a real hurdle to actually begin to build that relationship, and so that's really where a lot of our focus has been, particularly if you do share sort of the larger concerns about so trying to sort of bridge that gap between the things that a lot of journalists focus on, and I think rightly focus on. There's a lot of things that I do think matter in terms of improving the quality of the journalism itself. That I wouldn't tell journalists you should abandon your principles. I think we have to be realistic about whether or not all of those things are necessarily going to build trust with all of the audiences that you're seeking to build it with. So I think there's sort of two separate things involved there. But if you do want to build trust with some of those communities who are more disengaged, more disconnected, sort of more alienated from news, I think we have to be realistic with the fact that to reach them probably requires some different kinds of strategies than the ones that are probably most effective at reaching the people who are very engaged in following the news and maybe more skeptical for more ideological reasons or for more reasons that are specific to failures or inaccuracies in reporting that are connected to things that people are paying close attention to. I'll leave it there for now.
If I may jump in, I can build on that a little bit. One of the things, and thank you, that was really interesting, and your report is very interesting, Professor Toff. We discovered 4 user types when we did our research, and I'm not sure I spoke about this in my presentation, but when we did our first set of research, and this was early on in the Trust Project, we found 4 user types, and we found what we call the avid news user, and they check and cross-check the news. And in our most recent update, what they do is very much engage with news in a deeper level in terms of their own action activity. We found what we call the engaged user. Those are folks who pay attention to the news. They might subscribe, they are following it regularly. Then we found the opportunistic, which I think falls a bit into this area of people who are uninterested. They do pay attention to the news, but it's only when it sort of arrives at their doorstep. So if they've got to get a notification on their phone, or something happens where they want to know about it, or they're at work and it's on the screen in the break room. And then we have the what we used to call the angry disengaged, and now they're engaged with news that is often incorrect. So and then in our update, we did not find a lot of people who are completely unengaged. We found people who fit still into those 4 categories. And again, where we are trying to focus our effort is in some of the group that overlaps with what we heard about in that unengaged, and which we would call the opportunistic, and then also the engaged, because those are the people who are really looking for help. And the point that we just heard about anxiety and about news being distressing is so important. The content of news is very distressing, and yet people that we heard from felt a need to still be aware. So what we're looking for are ways that we can ease that anxiety. And we can't ease anxiety about the content of news because it's bad. Although there are techniques such as solutions journalism or constructive journalism that don't focus just on negative outcomes, but focus on ways that audiences can intervene and solutions possibilities. So I think that's very important to consider. However, from the point of looking at trust and building trust, we think of it as building confidence, and that's a way to ease that anxiety. So the other 2 areas that people were worried about, or that was causing anxiety, were areas around how do I decide on these platforms? How do I know whether this is trustworthy? How do I know whether I'm going to get caught up in misinformation? And so what we can do is provide some tools and structures to help them kind of navigate through this space. And in effect, when we talked about platforms and aren't platforms the problem, I mean, that's in part the reason we started the Trust Project, was because in this digital space, you're right, everything looks flat, everything looks the same. So as journalists, we have to differentiate ourselves. We have to find ways to show that 1, journalism is different. 2, you can figure that out on your own user. You don't need us to tell you. You can also decide which parts are more important. So with the trust indicators, you don't have to look at them all. There may be some that matter more to you. And third, you do have a role to play as an individual, and it's a very important role.
Thank you so much, Sally. And we're running out of time. Well, time is running very, very quickly. And if I may, Ms. Lehman, I have 2 questions for you. And then afterwards, we'd like to open up the floor for the panelists and the commentator. First question, Sally, is I think it has been pointed out by Professor Yamamoto, the Japanese mass media is not used to be evaluated by the third party. And this is related to this very issue. And Sally, you mentioned that the resistance, that the Trust Project, that site, your site, is confirming and vetting whether it's operating with the integrity. You need to carry out the inspection, right? And then the inspection, the third party, you be inspected. And the media who will be inspected, from my imagination, there are a lot of reluctance, I'm sure. They didn't want to be investigated. So in the Western media, the executives, what kind of rejection did they have? The third party evaluation to be evaluated. How were they reluctant? Or how did you overcome this hurdle of persuading these executives that you need to be inspected? If you have any episode or case studies, I would like you to share this story with us.
Yes, so you raise an important point. And what we found, or maybe the way I originally organized the Trust Project was to help avoid that. So we are working collaboratively with news organizations. And so they have a voice. And what we began with is the user voice, of course. And we didn't run into resistance against listening to the public. Sometimes there were surprises. One of the bigger surprises was when we talked to people and we heard repeatedly that they cared about hearing from more than just voices at high level of business and government, that they wanted to hear more from people who were like them. They felt underrepresented in the news. And they also were interested in hearing from people who were unlike them, so that they valued that. And editors were very surprised by that, but they didn't resist it. They went ahead. What they do resist sometimes is putting out information that may not put themselves in the best light. So as a result of that, I mean, they accept the idea that yes, we should be more inclusive in our reporting, and that can be very specific to whatever community we're reporting in. And I talked a bit about that. Sometimes we find resistance in willingness to be honest about, or being not honest, but being transparent about what their staff numbers really look like. So we just continue to encourage that, and we work with sites. The other area where we sometimes run into problems, and the journalists on the call may not be surprised about this, but in commercial labels. So one of the things that we're trying to do in journalism, with all the news companies that we work with, is help the public understand more about that agenda. And some of the questions that the report that Professor Toff talked about, where people asked about, aren't the business interests of news driving the agenda of the journalism that we see? And that seemed to be a concern that he found. We also found that. And so that's one of the reasons why we ask for labeling of commercial content, and very clear labeling. So there's one type of labeling that separates news versus opinion versus analysis, which was also very important in our user interviews. And then another type that asks news organizations to be very clear when they're showing, for example, native or journalism that is actually, it's not journalism, it's native advertising content. So it looks like journalism, but it's written from a perspective of an advertiser that has paid for that. Or we see a little less of that now, but maybe we see sponsored links, or we see funders that are providing funding to cover a certain area like travel or even health issues. And so we ask our news sites to be really clear when that's happening, because that is shaping your news agenda. And sometimes they get into fights or battles internally with the people that are selling the advertising. And so that is a major change that we're trying to enact within journalism, is to get some common agreement over what are these different types of paid content, if you will, and how can we disclose them more clearly to the public. Journalists, I think, are quite do understand the reasons why, because they don't want their journalism to be in their minds like polluted by the business interests. But because there are such, we are in difficult times for the news industry, then it can be difficult for them to convince their business department how important that is. So we just continue to work on that. And again, I would say the collaborative nature of our work, along with the repeated return to trying to understand what the public needs and wants, those two things help us move forward effectively.
Thank you very much. Another question I have for you: trust project effectiveness and feedback on that. Sari-san has done that. So could you share some of the results on that? As far as I know, the trust project itself, how effective the trust project is, there are 3 surveys you've done. 2018 in the UK, online media, the Mirror, reliability survey. And the second one I'm more interested in, the trust project, University of Texas, Austin. You have outsourced that news beat, fictitious one, and the comparison of trustworthiness of the news, the contents, very interesting result. We have found out trust indicators are implemented, and 3.8 and a score of 5, and with no mark, 3.6. So there are only 0.2 difference whether the trust mark is on or not. And the trust mark, does that affect the charge subscription or not? 58% no change, but willing to pay 8%, to some extent 25%. So total about 33% shows willingness to pay for good contents. But it's not such a striking result than we had anticipated. So 2020, the Ipsos survey you've done, 39,000 adults in 28 countries globally. And one of the findings was that trustworthy news, 27% of respondents are willing to pay for trustworthy news. So such a gap from the second survey with this year 2020 survey. So how do you see this good increase here?
Well, so thank you for going through those different pieces of research, and we do continue to do our research. The very first one was the UT Austin comparison, and we did that because we didn't know for sure whether the trust indicators would work, and because we saw, I mean, the numbers don't look huge, but they are statistically significant. And that is what the researchers pointed out to us, is that they actually were a very important result. And they said, you know, this is reason to believe that the trust indicators do work and are effective. So that was our original research. And again, the statistical significance, they said, was very important to note. The UK one that the Mirror did, they did that internally, and they were looking at, well, we are sure that they worked in this experimental setting. Can they work in the wild, so to speak? And they were very pleased with the results, with the 8% increase. And we told, and editors who were part of the Trust Project also felt that was very strong. They were quite pleased by it. The willingness to pay, well, actually, let me go to the trust mark first. So in the, we weren't sure how well the trust mark worked. And in fact, we weren't that concerned about it because our concern was mostly with the trust indicators themselves. But when we did recent research with the University of Georgia, we found that the trust mark alone increased trust significantly, again, statistically significant. And I want to underline, having been a science reporter myself, that often when you read results in these reports, you'll see a percentage difference and it's not statistically significant. So in fact, ours are, and that's important to note. Trust mark itself did increase trust in the site. And what was very important to that and about that, in light of the conversation we've been having, is that it was more effective among the people who were least trusting. So, and it kind of gets to the conversation that we've been having so far, that on the one hand, you have a group of people who are at least at some level interested in evaluating their news. And so they look at the trust indicators. Then you have another group who is either not trusting or less interested, and there it seems the trust mark is making a difference. Now, I will be honest with you, I think it's very important for us, if people are going to be looking at that trust mark, we have to make sure that it's backed up by evidence. So then it puts the pressure on us to ensure that we really do very strong compliance checks, and that it's hard to fake the trust mark. So we're working on that. The last piece about willingness to pay, I mean, I actually did not find the difference between 28 and 33% to be that significant. I thought, honestly, it seemed as though we are getting repeated measures of around 30%, not just our own research, but others. You see around a 30% increase in willingness to pay for news you can trust. And I think that we need to dive deeper into that area. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the Trust Project is collaborate with our partners to then see, like, how might we convert trust into more loyalty via subscriptions or memberships, and actually turn that into willingness to pay. And so it's not something where somebody just decides, I'm going to trust this, so I'm going to pay. We need action on part of the news organizations then to channel that trust. And news organizations talk about the news funnel or the subscription funnel. And that's where I would say the ones that are part of the Trust Project who are committed to building trust, then they can be more vocal about it in their subscription appeals, in their membership appeals. And then we can see how much of a difference does that make. And our suspicion is that it will indeed make a difference. And we know some news organizations are already operating on that premise, but I feel we can definitely do more there.